Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon from Manila, Philippines, and good morning to our friends who are based in Europe and Africa. Unfortunately, the ones in the other side of the world, North America, are probably still in the middle of the night, fast asleep. But still, nonetheless, we have a very international conversation today. I'm Renzo Guinto. I'm a physician by training from the Philippines with a public health background. I also work on a variety of public health issues, including the intersection between climate change and health, and much more recently, this area of decolonizing global health. So an issue, a space that I've been very excited about, especially reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, thank you very much to the University of Copenhagen, who I've had a very long and very good relationship with. Many years ago, I was able to take a certificate course in KU way back on global health challenges, one of my first encounters, with global health. And now I'm also affiliated with the School of the Copenhagen School of Global Health as an associate researcher. And of course, thanks to Ion Global Health, to our amazing students and young people who are the future of the colonized global health, right? So I think that is our goal. So yeah, it's really great to be moderating this conversation. And before we proceed, maybe I would like to ask our panelists first to also introduce themselves a bit to our audience. Maybe let's start with Mita.
Hi everyone, including everyone joining in Copenhagen. My name is Mita, pronouns she or they. I was born in Indonesia, but I've lived in a few countries. I'm not in academia at the moment. In fact, I work for a charity in the UK, but this is an issue that I have thought a lot about and plan on thinking more about. My background academically is in history and art history, specifically the British Empire in Southeast Asia in the early 19th century. That's a bit of background for me. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to hear from everyone. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Mita. Now, from the UK/Indonesia, let's fly now to South Africa. Let's have Emnet.
Good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure to join you all. I am based at the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Study at the University of Johannesburg. I am a political scientist, but I've been researching higher education issues for the past maybe 12, 13 years. I just moved to Johannesburg last year. I was based in Germany, in Bayreuth, at the University of Bayreuth. I studied at the University of Oslo also, so I know a little bit about Denmark. My research area mostly focus on African higher education. So decolonization is part of the debate now going on in Africa. So I'm really happy to join this group for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emnet. And then now let's have Somdeep. So we'll actually return to Denmark because that's where Somdeep is joining us from. Somdeep, please.
Thank you, Renzo. Hi, everyone, and thank you to Ion Global Health for this wonderful invitation. Renzo's right. You students are the future. I'm already tired of trying to decolonize. I feel like it's a losing battle sometimes. But on a more serious note, I'm trained as a political scientist, at the University of Copenhagen. I have a PhD from there. Currently, I'm associate professor in international development studies at Roskilde University, which is about 20 minutes from Copenhagen. Research-wise, I've been focused on international relations and the role of and the history of colonialism in the making of our global order, which of course feeds into inequalities in terms of global health. So I take theoretically a post-colonial perspective on things, a study on the global connectivities of colonial means of oppression and also anti-colonial struggles. I've been focused mostly on Israel-Palestine, but I've started moving more towards India, which is where I'm originally from, and looking at inequalities and how they reflect in the design and planning of places. So how cities are built in unequal ways, looking at high rises, looking at settlements, and how they reflect the pre-existing inequalities that already exist in the urban milieu. So yeah, great to be here, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Somdeep. And so to our audience, you just heard from our panelists. We're a pretty diverse group. We all originate from different parts of the world, but in particular, Asia and Africa. But also our experiences have been shaped by, by and in different places. We have Mita based now in the UK, Emnet, who also studied in Oslo, Somdeep from India, now transplanted or have been transplanted for many years in Roskilde. And, as I've said, I'm from the Philippines, but I actually just returned to the Philippines shortly before the pandemic began. Good thing I made it back before the lockdowns have been imposed because I just finished my doctorate at Harvard in Boston. And so, we all have very interesting kind of mixed experiences, right? And I guess, well, first, I was instructed or advised by our organizers, why are we, to give some initial thoughts on why we are having this conversation in the first place. As you are aware, as I've said, I've been deeply involved, at least in the past 2 years, in international conversations around decolonizing global health. And again, COVID-19 really exposed the colonial features of global health, from, who holds the money and the power and, the knowledge, all the way to the slow rollouts of the vaccine, especially in the developing world as we speak today. And so, that is where I'm coming from. But this discussion is more than decolonizing global health. It's about decolonizing academia, decolonizing all our disciplines. And you've heard from our panelists, we all come from at least four different but intersecting disciplines. At the end of the day, what we're now seeing in the COVID moment is all of us are really interconnected. And so we need to really have these transdisciplinary conversations. And apparently all of us wants to decolonize, right? That is what's happening now. A lot of parallel conversations in the fields of international development, in the humanitarian space. Even Mita, for sure, will talk about the decolonization movement, let's say in the world of art and history. And so maybe let's begin the conversation by reflecting about first the word decolonizing or decolonization. I mean, we're talking to fellow academics, I suppose, in this room, and maybe we are all aware of at least what's the dictionary definition of decolonization. Although decolonization or decolonizing also has so many different interpretations. So maybe let's start with that, and I want to hear from our panelists from where you are standing, from your respective disciplines. What do you mean by decolonizing? What are you actually trying to decolonize? And perhaps you can also reflect on your personal journeys from the time you were students to now being voices in your respective disciplines and sectors. Mita, maybe do you want to start and bring us to the world of art?
Oh, okay. Yeah, happy to. So I guess I will start by saying that in my view, I don't believe that academia can be decolonized. And the reason I say this is because, and apologies to everyone if that approach makes this entire panel obsolete. However, I do think it's an important conversation to have. For me, decolonization is a vision and a process to dismantle colonial institutions, and higher education is one of them, not just because it's a direct product of colonialism, but because it continues to perpetrate the same inequalities. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm coming from. And in terms of decolonizing any discipline, I think it has to be a much bigger conversation, because decolonization requires rethinking the entire purpose of education, of why we are engaged in all of this research, knowledge production, research. Who is it for? Who is it benefiting? What are the different structures that are in place to enable it? What are the different power dynamics that are in play to enable it? Who's continuing to be marginalized? These are all conversations that are very important to have. Ultimately, I think to decolonize academia is to abolish academia, because it requires the abolition of the researcher and subject relationship, the abolition of the researcher and audience relationship, the relationship between the subject matter and audience. So yeah, for me, it's about blowing it all up, I suppose, and then instead having much broader understandings of what we mean by knowledge production and distribution.
Thank you so much, Mita. In a way, you're saying we all in this room, I suppose we're all academics here, or at least have some, at least, one foot standing on the academic world, because Mita, I believe you're now in the practitioner side. But what you're saying is we should all be made obsolete. And perhaps, if that will be the case, if that is what decolonizing academia truly mean, what is the alternative, right? And maybe later on, we'll reflect on that collectively. Somdeep, do you agree with what Mita said, or is she too extreme when it comes to defining decolonizing academia?
Mita's crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. No, I think in many ways, Mita is right, and I was actually going to say something similar. And my perspective comes, of course, from international relations as a discipline that I'm trained in. And if you look at the history of the discipline, it is deeply embedded in racialized colonial hierarchies. In fact, some of the first, what you would call the original theoreticians of the field, they wrote articles at the beginning that eventually became textbooks that still educate students today, that rationalize and justify the racialized hierarchies and the domination of what they call the darker peoples of the world, because either they were not intellectually mature enough, or they had the resources, or they had resources that they didn't know what to do with. So they needed the domination to be dominated by the Euro-American universe for not just their benefit, so the civilizing mission comes in, but also for the benefit of the globe. Now, that's the foundation of international relations as a discipline. That is I would argue, the very purpose of what international relations as a discipline is and does. So how can we decolonize and still say that we are international relations scholars? Because we can't really escape what that very purpose is. So we would have to abandon international relations, at least from my perspective. And as Mita was saying, and this probably applies to most of academia, and abandon it sort of wholesale, and to reimagine what the purpose of the academy is. So if I'm to bring in some of my sort of personal story into this sort of discussion is something it was at the back of my mind while I was doing my PhD, but I was doing my PhD at the University of Copenhagen at the Department of Political Science. And those that are based in Copenhagen or in Denmark will know, disciplinarily, it's a fairly straight-edged department. And what I started noticing while I was a PhD is that somehow my theoretical, conceptual, methodological understanding of the world was somehow, was not understandable to these people. And I was really surprised because I'd lived all over the world. I'm, of course, originally from India. So, clearly the sensibilities didn't make sense, or the academic sensibilities didn't make sense. And that's when I started really discovering this discussion of why. Why is it that if I talk about Frantz Fanon, somehow that has no place in political science or international relations, even though Fanon is talking about these global hierarchies which international relations should care about. So there's that aspect of the intellectual aspect. But of course, decolonization is not a metaphor, right? It's also about materiality. And now I'm tenured as I move from PhD to postdoc to being in some places an interesting person, but not a hireable person. As someone who does interesting work, but can he really speak to a general, quote unquote, white general audience? Then you start realizing that decolonization is not just a metaphor. It's about materiality. It's about hiring practices. It's about what counts as the mainstream, what counts marginal. So yeah, so that's that's my journey, I guess.
Thank you so much, Somdeep, and very powerful reflections about the underlying I guess purpose of international relations, having been in this field for many years. And in a way, you're not saying we need to dismantle academia overall, but maybe there is a chance to kind of, for instance, in international relations in particular, at least be repurposed, or to rewrite what its purpose is in the 21st century, for instance. I wonder, and maybe later we'll discuss, what might be the role of, for example, people like you, who came from a country who is always the the subject matter of, let's say, an international development or relations thesis written by, quote unquote, a white scholar, right? And then now you're actually occupying a seat in the academia. How are you going to realize the transformation that you want to see, that you just mentioned a while ago? Now let's move to Emnet, who is actually a scholar, a leader of higher education. This is what he's been working on. Do you also agree with what you've just heard from Mita and Somdeep, or is there another approach or interpretation to decolonizing academia?
I think I agree, and I also disagree with them on many levels. But I think the most important thing when you discuss about decolonization of anything is there is an understanding behind the concept that a system or the institution has been colonized before. So there is a history of colonization that has to be decolonized. So now when you conceptualize decolonization, you have to go back one step and then conceptualize what has been colonized and how this colonization manifests itself. So then you dissect different elements within this broad notion of colonization in terms of institutions, knowledge production, purpose, origin, mission, vision, everything. So, and then you build on this historical base, you build the notion of decolonization. And this is one of the most important things in conceptualizing decolonization, understanding and conceptualizing, defining the history of colonization of higher education institutions or knowledge production in general in the global south. The second one is decolonization is not a static concept. There is no one definition of it. and the concept evolved over time. If I give you an example in Africa, the notion of decolonization in the 60s or early 50s even is defined within the concept of Africanization. You see, so most universities in Africa emerged out of this colonial experience. They were built, established by colonial powers, and just to serve the interest of colonial powers also. If you see the programs, the disciplines introduced in these universities, they are deliberately designed to serve colonial interests, like interpreters, pastors, finance experts, just to make sure that the colonial administration runs smoothly. So if you see the history of universities in Africa before decolonization or during colonial times, they have a specific purpose. They were not created to serve the interest of African societies. So in the 60s and in the 50s, starting from 50s, the discussion was, how can we incorporate African heritage? How can we make these institutions African? How can we, like, for example, include African philosophers, African writers, African experts in this institution? How can we introduce African courses, African languages? So Africanization within the broad discussion of Pan-Africanism, especially in the Black diaspora, was the framework of decolonization. And then of course, in the 70s and 80s, the discussion also changed in terms of Renaissance, African Renaissance. So the concept changed, and it all depends how you, what do you want to achieve when you discuss about decolonization. But the bottom line is, especially in African universities during colonial time, African heritage, African language, culture were not only ignored and excluded from the higher education system, but also depicted as backward, uncivilized. And the only way to become civilized was to uphold the European way of life, learning colonial language, becoming baptized as Christians, accepting European culture. So the system deliberately excluded African experience, African culture, African heritage. So there was this disconnection between universities in Africa and the African society. So the decolonization project is to reclaim and to regain this identity, African identity in African institution, and make sure that this institution actually serve also the interest of African society. It depends. I mean, if you talk about decolonizing knowledge production, that is it's another level of discussion. Then you have to talk about epistemology. Yeah, if you talk about decolonizing institutions, and there is also another level of discussion. This is about inclusion, ownership, belongingness, purpose, mission, all those things. So this is how I conceptualize or I frame decolonization in the context of higher education.
Thank you so much, Emnet, for your powerful sharing. And I like what you said, that the concept of decoloniality or decolonization is continuously evolving. And, because I'm a doctor who is working in the era of COVID-19, I might even say that the new decolonization is the COVIDization. And when I say the COVIDization, it's not getting rid of the world of COVID, although that is part of it. But getting rid of all the features of, for instance, the COVID response, right? And not just within the health sector, but in other sectors that really perpetuated and even exacerbated the existing inequalities and the power asymmetries. For instance, the militaristic approach to addressing the pandemic is something that unfortunately is a very colonial exercise that we've seen over and over again for the past several months and more than a year already. You also reminded us that when we talk about decolonization, we're trying to decolonize many different aspects. And I guess for the next couple of minutes, we will be actually looking into each of these building blocks of academia, knowledge production, as you've mentioned, the institutions themselves, the content of education, etc. And then you also mentioned about, and reminded us about looking back to history. What was the original purpose of these institutions when they were established? You mentioned that before African universities were built, not really to advance the welfare and the literacy, for instance, of African citizens, but really to benefit the colonizer. And we can see parallels of that in the history of public health. Before, public health was called tropical medicine or colonial medicine, because the concern is not really to improve the health of their colonies, but to make sure that the colonizers, their soldiers, and the leaders that they send to the colonies do not contract the tropical diseases in these places. So that's the history of medicine. And while that's not anymore the explicit goal of public health and global health, you see that kind of attitude in other forms, right? Vaccines being hoarded, intellectual property of vaccines not being openly shared. So it's not anymore protecting the colonizer in the colonies, but the colonial act has transformed into new ways. So, wow, I've just heard a lot of very, not just insightful, but even heavy ideas and insights and messages from all of you. I guess I want us to reflect as, I would describe ourselves as global South. And I hesitate even using the term because the global North, global South vocabulary is in itself a colonial remnant. But for the lack of an alternative, let me just use this term for now, unless you have an alternative already prepared. But as global South scholars who also receive education in the global North, but now speaking about decolonization, there's a lot of tension and even irony there. Maybe can you tell our audience about your personal experiences? How are you dealing with all these tensions and struggling with these again complexities? You're criticizing, for example, international relations, Somdeep, but you are now part of the apparatus. I myself have been speaking about global health coloniality, but I cannot deny that I received my education from perhaps one of the most colonial schools of public health in the world. So I think this is I think this requires really a spirit of honesty and openness. So who would like to start? I'm seeing you smile, Mita. So do you want to reflect on your personal journey and how are you dealing with all these tensions and struggles?
I mean, how much time do we have?
We have the entire day.
This
Just
could be
kidding.
like an endless conversation, like a group therapy session. No, but I guess I would say I agree with what Emnet was saying in terms of while we often think of decolonization as in reference to institutions in the global North, but of course, all institutions of higher education, because of its colonial history, including in the global South, are colonial. So I was educated in Indonesia before then getting scholarships to do my bachelor's in the US and then my master's in the UK. But I think, you know, the process of, I guess the process starts from even before going into higher education. And I mean, I don't know if this is now going a bit too far from the remit of this panel, but, you know, basically all levels of education needs to be decolonized. So my own personal experience with higher education anyway, I went to a small liberal arts college in the United States called Wesleyan University, and then my master's at SOAS, which is also like the colonial institution, if you will. And it's quite interesting because both of those countries, the US and the UK, are currently right now having very interesting conversations around colonialism and its legacies. I think in the US, you currently now have people are talking about critical race theory and whether it, you know, it's the discussion has been co-opted in various ways, but ultimately it is an important discussion about what is critical race theory, what is the colonial relationship and legacy with around that. Whereas in the UK, well, given the current government, there is a strong push for you know, very imperialist British nationalism, including in higher education. There's an insane like refusal to acknowledge colonial history critically in any way. I don't know if you're all aware of the recent Sewell report in the UK that denied that there's such a thing as, you know, institutional racism. But of course, higher education is in the UK are racist institutions, in my opinion. Not because, again, I guess it's important to recognize, I'm sure we are all kind of on the same page about this, but of course, racism and colonialism, we're talking about structures and systems. So we're not talking about the individualized, you know, staff, students. I just want to make that clear. So, okay, my personal experience in the US when I was doing my bachelor's was I studied history, and it was structurally embedded in the department where, you know, you had sub-specializations that was like, you know, history of the United States and Americas, history of early modern Europe, of modern Europe. And then you have us, which is to say everybody else, lumped into the same sub-department that was, I think, called like history of empires or something. It just basically meant anywhere, a history of any cultures or geographies that wasn't Europe or North
Western.
America. So I found that quite challenging, although I guess in hindsight, it was quite interesting because it did put me in touch with people who were doing scholarship on Latin America, for example. So I was able to kind of within that forced kind of categorization, able to develop my own thoughts and like cross global South intersectionalities, I suppose. And then I think they've restructured now though, so I don't want this to I hope Wesleyan's doing better. At SOAS, well, I mean, where to start? And I mean, I don't know how many people are aware of the history of SOAS, but you know, it began as a school to train colonial administrators, and I think in many ways it's one of those institutions that has had to confront that history and legacy. So there are conversations happening at SOAS, certainly amongst students and faculty, of how we can kind of, as far as you can within the constraints of academia, decolonize SOAS's legacy. So they're doing a lot of conversations around that. There's actually like I think there's like a working group and everything. But my personal experience is that, well, yeah, I mean, it was a very white faculty, even though the student body is very diverse. I would say that I was subject to, you know, racial and quite colonial microaggressions throughout my experience there from faculty. And for example, without naming names, because I was a scholarship student, I was once brought into one of the scholarship administrator's office. I had raised issue around like what we could use our grants for, and I was trying to propose whether I could use it for language study. And I was told that you don't need to have a third language as an art historian, which is absurd. But so she called me into her office and, basically said that, like, you should be very grateful that you're here, that we are, giving you this scholarship. We are trying to support Southeast Asian students, etc. Which that was kind of the most direct experience I've had of this kind of colonial attitude within academia. And it highlighted to me the imbalance in the power dynamic between faculty and students, especially students from the Global South, especially scholarship students, but also kind of on the upper level, the role of funding and how, scholarships are funded, how departments are funded, and how that can also limit our experience as students. So sorry, I don't know if that was too much of a ramble, but I love
it's okay. Yeah, well, thank you, Mita, and thanks for in a way you tried to bring us to your formative years, right, and how you saw and encountered academia's coloniality, whether through the design of the curriculum, right, the content that is provided to you in those history courses, or the way you were made to feel by that. Through that interaction about that scholarship, from Somdeep and Emnet, I mean, we all have very different experiences here. How are you dealing, and I guess focus more on the dealing part, right? I mean, apart from the experiences of the academia's coloniality, how are you actually navigating, maneuvering, trying to make changes in ways big and small? And in your respective again disciplines or professions, because I believe Emnet, you are now a leader in academia, so you're not just a scholar of higher education, you're actually you've assumed some leadership roles in academia, so that's quite an interesting position to have. And then Somdeep, as a professor of international relations, you've already started talking about some of your critique of the field that you belong to. How are you actually, affecting change day by day? Who would like to start? Emnet is already unmuted, so please, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, look, I grew up in a very rural part of Ethiopia. Yeah, I started my education there. And then I moved to India for a few months. That was my first international travel. And then I moved to Oslo. I did my master's there. And then I moved to Tampere in Finland. I did another master's there. I moved to Aveiro in Portugal. I did another master's there. I stayed for research training in Maastricht, which is in the Netherlands. And then I did my PhD in Germany, in Bayreuth. And I worked there for a while. And then now I am in South Africa. So how does this process or this experience affect or reflects, how can I reflect these things in my decolonial, debate or discussion? To be honest, when I was in Germany, I was not surprised that the faculty is white. It's supposed to be white. That is a German university. Most of the community, the society, the German society in that part of Germany are white. So I was not surprised. And most books are about German. The examples we discuss about German culture, the symbols on campus at the university is mostly German, which is expected. What surprised me is when I was in University of Free State in South Africa. So there, I didn't see any symbol of African, any African language, any African examples. When I was kid in Ethiopia, when we read student books, you know, kids books, the tree example is an apple tree. We don't have apple tree in Ethiopia. You see, let's start from there. The examples. I know more about European history than African history. I know more about European heritage than African heritage. I know more about European philosophy than African philosophy. This is how the education system produced, you know, young scholars. So I was not really surprised to see Eurocentric notion of knowledge in Europe. I'm surprised now to see these things as a dominant narrative in Africa. So when I was doing my PhD, for example, my PhD was a very, you know, simple thing. It was about regional integration in Africa. Why it's not working. So I tried to deconstruct regional integration theories, which are produced in the global north and still used to narrate the experiences of Africa. So I start from there. There is something wrong with these theories. That's why they fail to narrate the experiences of Africa, because we have a different context of integration as you compare it, if you compare it with Europe. So in my understanding, decolonization fundamentally challenged this global hierarchy and Eurocentric notion of knowledge production, which claims this Western value or Western theory at the closest objective truth or standard to measure rationality or to do research. Yeah. So when I sent my first publication on theory of regionalization, deconstructing the 1940s, 50s theory, you know, functionalist, neo-functionalist, all those intergovernmentalist theories, no journal was willing to accept because the reviewers totally rejected. But I keep trying, and finally, one of the journals accepted. But before that, I published it in a blog, in different blogs, so that, you know, the discussion starts. So there must be a different way of researching the experience of Africa or the context of Africa, because we have a different structure of regional integration. So that's how my experience started to build up. And now I'm in the field of higher education. So I fundamentally question or demand somehow how knowledge production or the higher education system accommodate multiple epistemic traditions. It's not only the West tradition or Eurocentric tradition. How can we incorporate also the epistemological tradition of others, including Africa? So in the production, distribution, and communication of knowledge. So my experience actually somehow supported this notion, or like make me even more activist in this journey of decolonization. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emnet. Uh, again, just like you, just listening to what you just said, it's quite striking that decolonization will also need to happen at home, in our own universities in Asia and Africa. Um, and we have to make sure that the future textbooks and children's books will not use anymore the apple tree as a symbol, but to celebrate the indigenous wildlife of our respective countries and cultures. Um, but you also, talk about now how you are trying to challenge, again, the coloniality of academia by exploring and again trying to include different epistemologies, especially those that are really appropriate and that reflect the situation in our specific context. And maybe later on in the second part, we can have a greater and much deeper discussion about how do you decolonize knowledge and knowledge production, research, especially that I think a lot of the people in the room, or in the Zoom rather, are researchers and scholars. I'll call Somdeep to also try to answer that big question. If you notice, I just asked you big questions as if we have the entire week to reflect and answer them. And after Somdeep, I'll read a question from the chat box. I also would like to encourage our participants to please either write your questions or comments in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will call you and I'll invite you to unmute later on. We have around 10 minutes, and then after that, we'll just have a quick 15-minute break. So Somdeep, please, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, how am I dealing with it? I mean, I can't just say not well, right? What you are pointing to are sort of some deep insecurities that I have. So thank you, Dr. Renzo, for bringing that up. I think that the fact that there is a global racialized hierarchy, that there's a global color line, as Du Bois called it, was very apparent to me when I moved to the US for my bachelor education in 2003. Now, 2003 is also the year when the US invaded Iraq. So that Black and brown lives mattered, only partially compared to white lives. Looking at how US media, covered, say, the death of Iraqis compared to the death of a soldier, the differences were very clear. So I was socialized in some way politically in that environment. So I think as a student, you often find other students who think like you. You are attracted to professors or who sort of furbish your thinking in that sense, right? I think it has been more of a challenge when I have tried to be employed within academia. And then you sort of realize, as Mita was saying, the real whiteness of the institution. So how I've had to deal with it, as a PhD, you sort of suppress and you try to talk in the language of the mainstream, right? Because you want to get a job, you want to get your Danish visa, and now I have a Danish passport. So, so you that's the ideal immigrant path. So you do what you need to do to follow that path. But it has been a lot about self-reflection, right? So what Renzo you were talking about is, we are, at least I am, trained in white institutions. I'm, going to high school in India, and I'm also trained in whiteness. It's a country that has fairness screams. It's a country that idealizes, if you say that you are fair, it means you're more beautiful, right? So I'm socialized in that thinking, right? So it's been a lot about self-reflection and thinking about, where does, talking about epistemological roots, so where does my thinking of the world come from, right? So unpacking a lot of that, unpacking my education from a Indian education system, which still sort of mimics the colonial education system. So it's been about that. It's been also about a realization that history doesn't work. You can't course correct history, where I can't indigenize or re-indigenize in a way where I bypass the impact of colonial rule on my, on my past, my family. So in my recent book, I actually reflect on, how we idealized growing up my grandfather, who we said that he was like a gentleman because he spoke in English, he read books in English, that was huge, and all his suits came from London, right? So it's part of, it's that sort of, struggle within myself. It's also been about what's there in the chat. It's about the curriculum. It's been about educating myself in the history of the discipline, educating myself about not just who speaks in the discipline, who has been silenced. So if you look at the foundation of international relations, you have these white male scholars who talk, right? Who are the who consider the mainstream. But now, thankfully, in the last 10 years, there's been loads of academic work that talk about, let's say, the Howard School of International Relations. Howard is a historically Black university in the United States, Renzo, based in DC. And there was a school of international relations scholars who were talking about the same issues of global order, global hierarchy, but from the perspective of the colonized, marginalized people. So it's been about introducing this sort of literature into the curriculum. Right, and I don't wait for institutions to tell me, to allow me to do that. These institutions are historically white, so it's difficult for me to do that. But it's my job as an instructor to integrate this sort of literature into the curriculum in a way that makes sense for my students. And finally, I think what I would like to say is that it's also this agenda of decolonizing is also a lot about performance, right? You see attacks in the US and the UK. These attacks are also coming out in Denmark, and some of our Danish colleagues will tell you where the parliament is discussing, bad research, and they're particularly pointing to critical race theory, of course, gender, queer theory, migration studies, because a lot of the migration studies is critical, and also study on the Middle East, right? So my job is also a lot about performance, where I tell I recently told a group of activists, you may have moral high ground, but you're not going to win by just claiming moral high ground. A lot of immoral things have happened in the world, even though they were immoral. I work a lot to make myself look formidable. So in terms of just knowledge about the field, but also where I publish, what kind of outlets I publish, I really work hard or try to, push this agenda in what you would call mainstream, largely white outlets. And I use that as a basis of claiming formidability and claiming a seat at the table against people who are, against this agenda. So.
Thank you so much, Somdeep, and especially for your, honesty, and also, allowing yourself to be in this position of, vulnerability, and I think we all do experience in one form or another these struggles, that this, for instance, this idea of wanting to get published for instance, in my field, you want to get published in a British or an American journal and not necessarily in an Asia Pacific journal, because unfortunately, even universities will score that less than if it were published in a Western journal. And so there are structural reasons, but also it's somehow ingrained in our brains and in our hearts that, and again, part of this education and experience. Although I also laud some of your initial thoughts as to how can we make changes, and you mentioned already, introducing non-mainstream writers into the curriculum, into the syllabus. But also it seems, and you've mentioned, you've written about some of these issues, we ourselves will need to write. And I guess write an alternative history of art in the case of Mita, an alternative vision for the future of higher education in the case of Emnet, an alternative definition and conceptualization of international relations in the case of Somdeep, and for me, trying to rewrite the narrative of global health for the post-COVID future, a global health that is not governed by the old white senior boys club sitting in, around the table in Geneva, but a global health that truly listens to the peoples of the world. We only have 1 minute before the break. So I will reserve the question from Maria, and then we have another question from Patricia, after our 15-minute break. And the next session, and I encourage our audience to please just take a break and please come back. The next session will be about solutions, right? The first session, we've heard about everybody's experiences, the challenges and struggles that we face. And obviously we can't really capture everything within an hour. We've already been talking for an hour and we've really just barely scratched the surface. But the next segment will be about solutions, way forward. How can we decolonize academia, even just by a bit? But of course, our goal is to decolonize it ultimately, because that's what Smita was telling us. We need to dismantle it. So let's return after 15 minutes and we'll resume the conversation. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the panel. So I guess we can resume the conversation. Is Emnet already back? Wonderful. Okay, awesome. So now we're all back, and I hope you were able to get some refreshments, or if you still haven't had your breakfast, a cup of coffee. Because I believe it is morning in Europe and in Denmark in particular. So now, as I've said, the remaining around 45 minutes that we have for this session will be dedicated to solutions and way forward. We've heard from our esteemed panel their personal experiences and perspectives around these very complex issues that we've been discussing. And so let's try to find ways on how to at least address some of these problems. And we wanted this session to end with perhaps a glimmer of hope that despite the problems, the challenges, the complexities, we can still solve these problems, and there's really a clear path forward. So, but I'll start by asking some of the questions that have been raised in the chat box. So Maria Harasim, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, has a question which Somdeep already somehow acknowledged already a while ago, but let's dig deeper into this question. Her question is a very practical one about the curriculum, which Mita also already touched upon a while ago. What onus do students versus staff have in ensuring that curriculum reading lists are not primarily white authors from the global north? So again, what Somdeep has already started exploring a while ago. Where do you think accountability for this particular change should be placed? Is it in institutions like the university? I guess to expand the question a bit, in terms of curriculum, in terms of content, the textbooks that Emnet was referring to a while ago, what sort of concrete ways can we adopt in order to at least decolonize the curriculum? Because Emnet, you mentioned there's so many things that need to get decolonized. So at least let's decolonize the curriculum. Let's decolonize content. What are some of the thoughts that you have? So who would like to start? Feel free to just unmute your mic. Otherwise, I'll keep on calling on Mita because she's the she's the first one that I see on my screen. Decolonizing the curriculum. Any suggestions? Any thoughts?
Okay, I can start.
Please, Emnet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the most difficult question and the most difficult part of the decolonization debate so far. How can we go forward with a decolonization project? But I think the answer depends on what exactly do we want to achieve in the decolonization process. So, and I mean, the context is also quite different, the decolonization debate and the expectation in South Africa, if you see it from other decolonization debates in Ghana or in Ethiopia, it's a totally different story. So decolonization, for example, in the context of South Africa, started, with this aspiration for inclusion, to make the higher education institutions more inclusive to all races, to address some of the legacies of apartheid. South African higher education institutions were predominantly white, and they were not really open for Black students, Indian students, and colored students, as apartheid classified the entire population of South Africa. And this legacy has been, reflected in many ways in contemporary universities of South Africa. So decolonization writers or activists, even projects, decolonization project focuses mainly to open up institutions so that people from different backgrounds can join universities. And this is what is actually happening at the moment. I mean, for the past 5-6 years in South Africa. And so this is one of the actions that South African higher education system has been doing. And the other thing is the curriculum itself. Once students join university, what are they learning in each and every discipline? As you mentioned, references of mostly Western authors has been the main trend or tradition in most universities in Africa. And this is now changing. Now, universities are also including local authors, African authors, not only from Africa, but also in the diaspora to be part of the curriculum as an alternative view for some of the discussions that we have in our universities. There are also courses introduced in African language, in literature, for example, in culture and history, in all those things. And there are also courses on African history, African heritage, African civilization, and all those things. So these are some of the tiny initiatives that are actually going on in many African universities at the moment. But this is just a very, I don't know, like putting a spoon of water out of a sea as compared to the issue that we are dealing when we talk about decolonization. That's a huge thing. We are talking about the entire epistemic business. What is knowledge in our university? What kind of things are considered knowledge, and who legitimatize knowledge? How can we, for example, now we have program on indigenous knowledge systems. Yeah, we have in this program, we have indigenous research methodologies, indigenous theories, indigenous of different sorts of knowledge production. So when people compare those indigenous knowledge production with the dominant narratives that we know from the West, there is a huge difference. And how can we bridge a gap between these two epistemic traditions? Last year, we published a book on hybrid knowledge production with another colleague from Germany, Professor Irina. So what we try to do is, try to accomplish in this book was, the argument is all knowledge sources, all knowledge production processes are equally relevant. So we have to acknowledge that to start with. And then if we acknowledge the relevance of all knowledge sources, whether it's in the global south or north, and then the next stage is how are we going to create a legitimate, a sound dialogue between different epistemic traditions so that we can incorporate them in our higher education systems. So extreme Afrocentric writers, they really romanticize, indigenous knowledge system and demonize Western tradition and knowledge production. They say, no, we don't need anything from the West. This is extreme Afrocentric standpoint. And at the same time, we can't also say, yeah, knowledge is a universal thing, so we have to just keep what we have been doing for the past 20, 30, 40 years. So there must be some kind of dialogue between different epistemic traditions. And this dialogue has to be reflected in our higher education system. And that's what we try to do in this book, hybrid knowledge production, which is like a tiny contribution as a way forward in the decolonization project. There are different ways of, recently I saw in Ghana, I shared it in my D-Link social media. I saw in Ghana, they changed the uniform of students into African cultural dresses. It's a tiny move, but it's a very important move. So students can feel home. The students can feel that this is my institution. This institution reflects my culture. So I feel like I'm home when they go to university or schools. In South Africa, they change the names of the buildings. It's a tiny movement, but it creates a significant impact on the sense of belongingness. Where are African names on these old buildings? We never seen them before. Now there are African names, you see? So when we say a decolonization project, it's a huge task, but there are small and practical moves which are actually happening in many African universities, right, which can be used as an example. Also for other experiences.
Thank you so much, Emnet. That's a lot of concrete examples that universities, academic leaders can actually replicate. For instance, that changing of the uniform. Yes, you said it's a small act, but decolonization is both political but also psychological. It's a psychological process, and these simple changes in symbolism or the renaming of buildings, over the past several years, we've seen major universities in the world changing the name of buildings from, before they were named after slave owners, and then now they were named after, women of color, right? Or scholarships being renamed. So we're seeing some changes in academic institutions in the quote unquote quote north, and you just gave some examples of how it can be done and how it's being done already in developing countries, in places like in universities, for instance, in the African continent. How about Somdeep and Nita? Do you have anything to add in terms of how do we, well, the question originally is about decolonizing the curriculum, but Emnet already is bringing us to this much broader terrain of decolonizing knowledge production. Any thoughts?
I mean, just to sort of,
Somdeep.
sorry, just to add to what I've said before, and I agree with Emnet. I mean, the context of decolonization sort of changes depending on where you are. So in a context like Denmark, I mean, there's a broader struggle here of mainstream recognition, deliberation, and critical reflection on Danish colonial history and slave trading history and how that affects academic institutions and academia in general. That's some, you know, that's a big fish to fry, as they say. But in terms of my everyday activities as an instructor, as a teacher, it's gone back to thinking about disciplinary histories and how to educate our students about the history and the politics of science, right? A lot of times when we talk about the discussion right now in Denmark, for instance, is that those that talk about gender, sexuality, race, colonialism, migration in a critical way, they are bringing politics into, you know, an otherwise objective field, which is science, right? So a lot of the discussion in my class, when I'm talking about methods, when I'm talking about disciplinary history, is to talk about the politics of science and how politics plays a deeply formative role in determining priorities or in spurring on scientific success, right? One of the examples that I like to bring up is of J. Marion Sims, who is considered the father of modern gynecology. He also did all his tests on slave women and used that sort of globally embedded hierarchy for scientific progress. So a lot of the things that I talk about in class starts off by unpacking the notion of science and what kind of deep politics is intertwined in arguing that science is somehow apolitical. And then I move on to talk about disciplinary background, where does knowledge come from? How do you know, as one of my colleagues once said, how do you know what you know, right? That's, you know, a good way to ask the students, how do you know this is the mainstream of a discipline? What made it the mainstream? And then try to use that discussion to, you know, as Emnet was saying, to demonstrate the multiplicity of the ways in which, for my field, international relations, politics, and society is encountered and experienced. So that's been my strategy. But yeah.
Yep, thank you, Somdeep. I think that's quite instructive also to other scholars and professors who's in this event, in this audience, who share the same, in a way, positionality that you have. So that's what's interesting. Emnet gave a more, you know, a perspective coming from an academic who's based now in Johannesburg. Now you're in Denmark. But Mita, you had an academic training, but now in the realm of practice. So that's actually quite a very interesting and unique position to have as well. What can you say about, you know, and you already talked about your previous experience about history courses being too Western and white. But now that you're in the realm of practice, how can we further enrich education and even make it more decolonized and make it more, perhaps, or even prepare the next generation for the kind of work that you're in right now? I hope that's not a very difficult question.
Yeah, it's a big one.
If you notice, I tried to bring like several questions together. So
yeah, first of all, I would kind of reject the dichotomy of research and practice. I don't consider myself a practitioner. I just happen to work outside academia, which is only one of the many industries that we have in society. So that's my position on that. I do want to address the curriculum issue though, because I think there's a lot to be said there, and it's a good question and point to start the conversation. So I actually have 3 responses. I thought about this over the break. So my first initial response with regards to, diversifying the curriculum is I'd like to kind of address the students in the room that you do not have to stick to the syllabi. You can go beyond the reading list. As Emnet said, all knowledge is relevant and valuable. So you get to be creative, and you should want to reclaim that power to educate yourself, not because it should be your burden, but because the academia will not do that for you. It will not save you unless you reclaim that power and that space for yourself. My second response is, why are we trying to diversify the curriculum? Is it about representation? Because the point I want to make is that it's actually quite dangerous to conflate representation and decolonization. Because to me, decolonization is not about diversification of knowledge. And it's definitely not about bringing Black or brown people into a colonial system, because that's just more extractivism and that's just more colonialism. So we have to think about these issues much more, broadly, in that, why are we doing this? For example, if university students get to read Spivak or Fanon, only to graduate, get a degree, write a paper that will sit behind a paywall, what good does that do? Like, does that actually decolonize anything? I don't think so. And so that's why I think a diverse curriculum, or even a building name change, if we are only seeing it as a cosmetic, superficial change, it will actually risk being used to whitewash, or I guess black and brown wash, the continued coloniality of academia. So I want us to be careful about that. And my third point is that actually I think the question touches on the core of the problem, which is power and responsibility. And Somdeep actually addressed this early on in this panel. Academia is an industry, and it's one of the more exploitative ones. And it's one that currently operates under capitalism, in that capitalism dictates the material conditions in which academia operates. And so racialized capitalism structures these power dynamics, structures what power is granted to whichever individuals. And so we have to be aware of those power imbalances. For example, that separates, the scholarship student from the global South, the working class adjunct professor who doesn't have tenure, versus, the donors, the university trustees, the people who actually get to make the decisions. So I think everyone has different powers under racialized capitalism. Therefore, a syllabus isn't just a syllabus, but it's about power and who has power to determine what gets read and what gets studied. And so the conversation to me needs to be about how we redistribute that power at large. So I think the question about curriculum should be about uncovering those power imbalances to know where those accountabilities lie. So for me, we need to be conscious and targeting those material conditions. So it's not just about, diversifying the curriculum. So that's my spiel. Sorry.
Yep. Thank you, Mita, and thanks for the word of caution when it comes to focusing on the cosmetic and forgetting about what lies beneath, right? And you also thanks for raising the point that ultimately this is closely, if not deeply, intertwined with capitalism, which you called racist, but also capitalism that is sexist, and ultimately colonial. And it's interesting because I would say academia is the one that, while not created capitalism, definitely developed the body of work that explains it, and that now academia continues to fuel that. And then in return, we're depending on the capitalist system, as you've mentioned, the grants that we receive, the journals that are really ultimately money-making exercises, the universities that depend on either high tuition fees or philanthrocapitalism, the donations from the higher elite. And so the question is, should, as part of decolonizing academia, should the dismantling of capitalism be part of academia's mission? I think that's also another question that maybe will require another conference because we don't have enough time. Please feel free to give your initial thoughts on this. I think one question that relates to what we're already discussing about power asymmetries is from Patricia Heuberger. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. Renzo, you already touched on the notion of the North-South dichotomy. Myself working in this space, I keep on struggling with the term. Is there any replacement for the term notion when we want to speak on science collaborations between Northern universities and Southern universities? I think to expand this question, we've talked about symbols, we've talked about curriculum, we should also talk about the vocabulary of academia and our respective disciplines and the colonial messages that are embedded in these vocabulary in our glossary. But ultimately, again, the inequalities that persist, which academia inadvertently or intentionally is actually helping perpetuate and even worsen. So any thoughts on this, again, massive theme of vocabulary, capitalism, power asymmetry? Somdeep, please.
Yes, can I just go because I have to run at 10:45.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, but one of the things that I have struggled with, thank you, Patricia, for this comment, for this question. I try to reject those or not use those sort of dichotomies of North and South. One, because it's a fuzzy concept, right? In the sense that, we are, technically I look Southern, but I've been educated in white institutions. So that whiteness has been somehow placed in me, and it's very difficult to sort of get rid of it. Just the other day, my son, abandoned his fork and he was eating with his hand. And I was like, why are you eating with your hand? And then he was like, well, in India, you eat with your hand. Why can't I eat with my hand? I'm like, touche, brother. So, this whiteness is embedded in us, right? So it's difficult to, the divisions aren't as clear. But what I often feel that when you say Southern perspective or Southern driven, oftentimes it becomes what Mita is talking about diversity, mere representation. Sometimes it feels like affirmative action. But I would say that it's much more substantial. That lack of, let's use the word representation, renders, say, international relations bad science. You're doing a bad job in understanding the global order, right? So it's not just it's much more substantial than representation, which what to me North-South divisions end up being. It's about a misunderstanding of how the world works from the international relations perspective. So when I say that we should talk about Fanon, or we should incorporate how CLR James talks about cricket and race and global hierarchies, I think that's important, not just because we need a Caribbean face in the mix, but because there is an understanding of the global order that's missing, and that is diminishing our understanding of how the world works, how power works, how capitalism works, how racism works, how gender works, so on and so forth. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Somdeep. Any other thoughts?
I think it's uncomfortable to use, these divisive words, global South, global North, traditional and modern, Western, and all those dichotomies. But I think one of the things that we can't deny is that there is difference. There is this camp, whether it's 2 or 3, there are some camps that we have to qualify them when we discuss about them. In this context, I think the best term so far in my readings and when I'm also writing, so far the best term that I found is the global north and the global south. There is no additional connotation attached explicitly to these notions, except describing the geographic difference. And then, of course, we add context to the discussion. We add, for example, when we talk about decolonization, we say, yeah, the global hierarchy of knowledge takes Western social constructs of truth for granted, in the process of also exclusively centralizing the experience and interest of the global north. So we are referring a geographic location which has the upper hand in this hierarchy of knowledge production. So the whole decolonization debate in this context, for example, why when alternative point of view is taken into account, for example, when we talk about knowledge production, it's only taken as data, not as part of construction of theory, like in the context of, for example, the global north. Why don't we take indigenous knowledge systems and knowledge production processes as a main and also integral part of theory construction and use them in our knowledge production in our institutions? So it's very challenging to, we have to name them, but how can we name them without, putting some sort of connotation of power relation, which undermine one over the other? And that is a challenge. But I use also the global south and global north in all of my publications, because I found it's the only comfortable, I would say, categorization of the two worlds that I'm dealing with in my research.
Or at least for now, the most readily available typologies.
Exactly.
Although,
yes.
as someone who works in the area of climate change and health, I always say we should start categorizing. Oh, bye, Somdeep. Somdeep has to run to another
Thank you.
class. But thank you so much, Somdeep.
Thank you.
And we should
drop
keep
an
in
email
touch.
to
We
you.
should keep in touch, right?
Yeah.
And the organizers will facilitate that via email. So thanks, Somdeep, for your contribution. Stay safe.
All right, thank you.
Going back to what I was just saying, in my work in climate and health, climate change and its impacts on health, one typology that I always use is which countries are the most carbon polluting and which countries are the ones that will suffer the consequences, right? So, I'm not using the north-south, although as if you take a look at which countries fall under each category, those are the countries that still fall under the north-south classification. But the discussion has changed, right? The framing has changed. And what you're saying, Emnet, is we can still use these terms, but we need to do a bit more explaining and a bit more, I guess, analysis, right? What are the underlying connotations behind, again, north-south, developed, developing? World Bank always uses low, middle income, high income. But I'm of the opinion that we should now start calling countries, high carbon and low carbon, vaccine hoarding and vaccine scares. We're all laughing, but that's the reality now of this unequal world. Mita, do you have other thoughts about this? And then we'll proceed to the last segment of our discussion.
Sure, I think a lot has been addressed already. Obviously, language is power, so terminology matters, but also no term will be perfect. So I think, we all have to kind of make do with the limitations of language itself almost. I think with global south and north, actually think it was primarily geographical distinction. In fact, I believe it was like, kind of coined and then used as a response against even less imperfect terms like third world or developing, So it's a continued process of trying to better our terminologies to reflect our principles, My issue, however, with global north and south is that it obscures. Okay, let me take that back. The other thing about terminology is that it is liable to be co-opted and its meanings changed. And I think that's kind of what's happened a little bit with global north and south, is that it's kind of been rendered meaningless. I think at the beginning, I think it was a political term and it's trying to highlight socio-political realities, but now it's kind of just, umbrella terms that people throw around sometimes. So as a result, the terms as it's currently used might obscure the actual processes and those socio-political realities that it was trying to highlight in the first place. So I think the solution for me, though, is use the terms if you must, but I think do it with honesty and integrity and qualify what you mean so that your audience understands what you mean. But I think even better is if you can be specific about the process that you are addressing and describing, kind of like what you said, Renzo. Like maybe it's, you need to be specific. Are you talking about vaccine hoarding countries? Like, is that the process that you're trying to criticize? Are you talking about imperialist countries? Are you talking about settler colonialist countries? So I would say, like, be as precise as you can in addressing what it is that you're trying to say.
Cool. And I appreciate that language is powerful, and that's another arena where we can really start decolonizing. You also gave a word of caution that, again, these words will or might lose their meaning. There's so many words in international development that has unfortunately lost their true meaning. Development itself, sustainability, resilience has become a buzzword. Everyone calls whatever they see as resilient. And that might happen also with the word decolonization if we do not, if we are not mindful, right, and not careful, and not, as you've said, careful and and explicit, and to qualify what do we really mean. So, well, this has been a very rich discussion, and we only have around 11 minutes before the end. And we've listed already a lot of things to do. Again, ways big and small in terms of decolonizing, from the cosmetic all the way to the transformational. And this will require time, but also will require big numbers of people who are committed to working together in, again, dismantling these power asymmetries, and perhaps offering a new blueprint for the future, a new academia, maybe not totally dismantled as Mita first implied, but an academia that metamorphoses into something new that is inclusive, is acknowledging the pluriversality of knowledge, what Emnet keeps on advocating for, the multiple and the different epistemologies. We already touched as well on some of the practices in academia, from curriculum to, but it's also not just about, again, as you've said, Mita, hiring more people of color and people from the South to join imperialist academic institutions in the North. And we also need to change the universities in the South, as already shared with us by Emnet. I want this to be a very interactive and inclusive session. And as I've said, we need the numbers. So I would like to actually, and this is not part of the program, I would like to invite our audience to write something in the chat box, either your main takeaway from this session so far, or what are the things that you are now planning to do, even a small little step to help decolonize academia, even just by just a bit. So I would love to see some answers in the chat box. I will read some of the more intriguing ones. And while waiting for the responses from our audience, maybe I'll ask Emnet and Aria to just give some closing remarks, although this case is far from being closed, as we've just gleaned. But if I guess, and I'm also like running out of questions to ask because we've just discussed so many different things and we went to so many directions. So I guess, your final words and like words of encouragement, perhaps something that you want to see in the next year or two, the kind of change that you want to see, to give us a bit of, again, hope and a sense of optimism that this decolonizing academia movement is not really an abstract and perhaps an impossible dream to achieve. And I'm still waiting for our participants to share some of their thoughts in the chat box. I really hope that you can, share some of your thoughts. Emnet, I see you unmute. Please, you can start.
Yeah. I'm really grateful to be part of this discussion, and thank you all for organizing such an interesting topic, especially coming from Europe. It's quite important to push this debate and to put this debate among young scholars of all background. I think, as I have said earlier, the debate of decolonization has evolved a lot.
Cynthia, hi. Good.
Oops. Please continue.
Yeah. So, the debate has evolved a lot, and now we are at the stage that we are trying to make sure that inclusive higher education system or inclusive knowledge production prevails in all academia. That is the bottom line. So when we say decolonization, it's not necessarily leaving everything about European experience, let's say in Africa or generally in the global South, but how can we create an understanding between different traditions of knowledge production, whether it could be in Europe or in Asia or Africa. So that is the fundamental element that we have. I would say we have to push to create an understanding among different epistemic traditions so that we can collaborate, work together in reaching, the global society. Of course, we can't avoid the issue of power. And that is a fundamental truth. Also, we can't avoid the issue of power as long as we are living in an institution where the main business is knowledge production, which affects the day-to-day lifestyle of every individual. But what we are trying to advocate is we have this sector, this industry of knowledge production has to be inclusive in all senses. Yeah. And that is my take, and that is what I wanted to also share with my colleagues. And I'm very grateful to be part of this discussion. I hope we will continue collaborating on different levels. And thank you also, Dr. Renzo, for chairing. It was really entertaining.
Thank you so much, Emnet. And before I call on Mita, I'll read some of the comments in the chat box. Really, really exciting and inspiring comments from some of our participants. Emnet, you actually reminded us of our responsibility as academicians. We're really ultimately in the business of knowledge production and eventually dissemination, transfer, and translation. But, at the very first part is knowledge production. And we're the ones educating the world. We are the ones shaping the discourse and introducing new terms, right? The global north, global south. So we really have a huge responsibility, and but also a huge opportunity in this decolonizing everything movement, right? We need to start walking the talk and and set an example with the hope that ultimately global governance will decolonize. The health systems and the hospitals will decolonize. The different professions will decolonize because the very sector that produces the knowledge that has a very colonial function has decolonized, and that is us. I will just want to read some of the really powerful comments here. And I hope everyone is reading as well. Lorraine Vivian said, I believe transformation is a question of disposition. Oh my God, everything is moving very fast. Simply how each of us enter a room and engage. We need to build platforms where facilitators engage with science in this way. We have some very practical comments, like, Esther Mayland said from UYO, University of Oslo, when I welcome international guest researchers and exchange students, I will talk a little bit more about how we do things here, for instance, in Norway, and ask them how it is where they come from. So, really having this attitude of, empathy and radical listening, true listening about other people's, their perspectives is always a very good first step. Isabella Ravina said she will broaden her reading list to include authors from colonized nations. And, Cecilia Price was giving some of her takeaways. Decolonization is political and psychological. Let's think of other trees to use in our textbooks, not just the apple tree. And there are no real dichotomies, which Mita also raised. So very, very insightful comments here. And I hope that our organizers will actually take note of these comments, and maybe you can include them in the proceedings, the report of this session. I'll give the last mic to Mita. Any last words of encouragement to our audience?
A lot of pressure. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the comments in the chat as well. Well, I would like to return to my point at the beginning, which is that I believe that we do need to abolish academia as we know it. I think that is the only way to decolonize academia. And that is because the classroom, the archive, the idea that one person gets to decide the curriculum in a classroom, these are all colonialist ways of operating, As Emnet said, decolonization is about recognizing all forms of knowledge. And in order to do that, you need to devalue the academic institution as the sort of sole gatekeeper of that knowledge. And so that's what I mean by it would require a self-effacing of the importance placed on Western academic institutions, recognitions, including in the global South. But, short of a revolution, I do think that there are things that we can do both within and outside academia, focusing, for example, on practices like collective knowledge production and sharing, self-publishing, kind of rejecting this notion that academia has to be an inherently elitist and capitalist institution. Join your union if there is one, and if there's not, start one. Fight for better material conditions for minoritized faculty, staff, students. When you see your colleagues in a different institution struggling, speak out for them, use your privileges where it matters, protest when it's tactical. And you can always operate outside academia, that's ultimately what education should be about, is for social good. And so all of these conversations would mean nothing if we're not actually translating it into bettering, communities in the grassroots. And then lastly, we hadn't talked about this at all, but I think a very important aspect of decolonization is around language and translation. So making sure that conversations and, expertise are translated across languages, across cultures. So that would say, I guess if we had to start somewhere, that would be where I would start.
Thank you so much, Mita, again, for those words of encouragement and those important reminders. And, I'm actually reminded that, and I think we need to acknowledge that we are in this very privileged space of Zoom. Not everybody one, have the Wi-Fi and the gadget to be able to participate, but also we're using English, unfortunately, still the lingua franca of academia. And the use of English itself already marginalizes the majority of the world's peoples from these kinds of conversations. And so, I hope in our own little work in our respective fields and careers, we find ways to communicate our messages to a diversity of people. I remember my doctoral dissertation was half written and half film because I wanted to make sure that more people who may not be able to read my 200 pages dissertation will at least get a glimpse of the messages that I want to share through a 5-minute film. And so that's what Emnet was also saying, different forms of epistemology, different forms of creative output, right? Maybe in the future doctoral dissertations will not need to be 3 articles published in a journal or a monograph, because anything can be a work of scholarship, right, in many different forms. This has been a very rich and inspiring conversation. What we learned is that we have the power to change, and we can affect change in ways big and small. And this is the challenging part. After this privileged conversation in the Zoom bubble of academia, we're now going back to the real world. And the challenge is, what are we going to do with the newly acquired knowledge and insights that we have now to change academia and to decolonize the world? Thank you very much to our panelists, Mita and Emnet, and of course to Somdeep. Thanks to Ion Global Health and the University of Copenhagen for this amazing opportunity to have this conversation, for me to be able to moderate this collective reflection. And of course to our participants, to our audience who did not only participate through the chat box, but spent the past 2 hours co-reflecting with us for on how to achieve a much better world. Again, thank you, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renzo, and to our panelists and the audience. Thank you very much. Have a good day.